Stop staring at me. Make it quiet. Make it stop. The words exploded out of Lucas Coleman, as if his body could no longer contain them. His voice was hoarse, jagged, stripped of any filter. It echoed violently across the hotel lobby, bouncing off marble columns and glass walls, turning the very space into an amplifier of his fear. Several guests froze. A man near the concierge desk frowned and shook his head. A woman instinctively covered her child's ears. Someone whispered, sharp and impatient, "This is a 5-star hotel." Lucas didn't hear any of that the way adults heard it. What he heard was everything at once. The hum of the chandelier lights above him drilled into his skull. The clatter of rolling suitcases felt like explosions. Perfume, cologne, cleaning chemicals, scents layered on top of each other until his chest tightened. Voices overlapped. Shoes clicked. Phones buzzed. Too many signals. Too much input. His brain, wired differently, slammed into overload. "I can't make it stop." Lucas screamed again, clawing at the air as if he could push the sounds away. "It's too fast. Too loud." He bolted forward, then abruptly changed direction. His movements sharp and uncoordinated. His sneakers squealed against the marble floor as he ran in tight, frantic loops. His hands flew up to his ears, then dropped again, then clenched into fists. His breathing became shallow, rapid, short gasps that barely reached his lungs. Richard Coleman stood just a few steps away, rooted in place. At 40 years old, Richard had built an empire by mastering chaos. He understood volatility, risk, pressure. He had stared down collapsing markets without blinking, but nothing in his experience prepared him for watching his 6-year-old son unravel in public, powerless to stop it. "Lucas," Richard said, forcing calm into his voice, though his chest was burning. "Hey, buddy, look at me." Lucas didn't look. He couldn't focus long enough to recognize his father's face. His attention ricocheted wildly from the light reflecting off a suitcase wheel to the echo of his own scream, to the sensation of the cold air brushing his arms. His body felt like it was moving faster than his thoughts, like a car with the accelerator stuck to the floor. "I don't like this," Lucas shouted, dropping suddenly to a crouch and rocking hard. "I don't like it. I want it quiet." A hotel employee took a cautious step forward, then stopped, unsure. The concierge whispered urgently into a headset. A security guard hovered near a pillar, waiting for instructions that hadn't come yet. No one knelt down. No one spoke to Lucas at eye level. Richard felt a familiar, sickening mix of emotions twist inside him. Fear, frustration, and a sharp edge of humiliation he hated himself for feeling. He had warned them. He had explained. He had told the front desk his son had ADHD, that crowds and noise could trigger episodes like this. He had asked for a quiet check-in, but ADHD wasn't visible. And invisible things were easy to dismiss. "Sir," the hotel manager said carefully, approaching Richard instead of the child, "perhaps we should escort your son to a private area until he calms down." Escort, remove, hide. Richard's jaw tightened. "My son is not a disturbance," he said flatly. "He's overwhelmed." Lucas sprang to his feet again, energy surging back in a chaotic wave. He ran straight toward a luggage cart, skidded to a stop at the last second, then spun around, disoriented. The sudden metallic clang as a suitcase shifted sent him over the edge. He screamed high, piercing, raw. A few guests recoiled. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Richard stepped forward instinctively, then stopped himself. Every specialist he had ever worked with echoed in his head. "Don't grab him. Don't restrain him. You'll make it worse." So he stood there, helpless, while his son's nervous system misfired in real time. Lucas dropped to the floor again, curling inward, knees to chest, rocking violently. His fingers dug into his hair. His sobs came fast and uneven, the sound of a child drowning in sensation. "Too much," Lucas whimpered. "Daddy, it's too much." That broke something in Richard. He lowered himself halfway, then hesitated, aware of the eyes on him. The judgment. The silent verdicts from people who had never lived a single day inside his son's mind, and still, no one else moved toward Lucas. From the far side of the lobby, Annie saw everything. She had been sitting quietly on a low bench near the wall, her feet swinging back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. Her backpack rested beside her, faded, frayed, one zipper tooth missing. Inside it were a sandwich her mother had packed and a small notebook filled with uneven drawings. Annie was waiting for her mom to finish her shift. She knew this lobby well. She knew how adults passed by her without seeing her, how her presence blended into the background like the housekeeping carts and the potted plants. She had learned to be patient, to be invisible, but Lucas was impossible to ignore. Annie recognized the signs immediately. The frantic movement, the hands over the ears, the way his body seemed to fight itself. She had seen kids like him at school. She had felt something similar herself on loud days, when the classroom felt too bright and the noise pressed in from all sides. She slid off the bench. Her sneakers barely made a sound as she stepped onto the marble floor. She moved slowly, carefully, the way you approached a frightened animal, no sudden gestures, no loud words. "Hey," a hotel employee hissed sharply when he noticed her. "You shouldn't." Annie stopped but didn't retreat. Richard turned at the sound and saw her approaching his son. A small black girl, thin, quiet, too close. "Don't touch my son," Richard said immediately, his voice edged with fear more than anger. Annie looked up at him, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I won't," she said softly. "I promise." Her voice was calm, unhurried. "I'll just sit." Before anyone could stop her, Annie lowered herself to the floor several feet away from Lucas. She crossed her legs and placed her palms flat against the cold marble, grounding herself. Lucas didn't notice her at first. His brain was still racing, his body still caught in the storm. Annie waited. Then she began to tap her fingers gently against the floor. Tap, 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 tap. Slow, steady, predictable. Not another sound added to the chaos, just a rhythm. Something consistent, something safe. Lucas's rocking stuttered. His sobs broke unevenly. Richard felt his breath catch. "What is she doing?" the manager whispered, alarmed. Richard didn't answer, because Lucas's head tilted slightly. His hands loosened from his ears. His breathing, still fast, began to find a faint rhythm that matched the tapping. Lucas looked up. He saw Annie sitting on the floor, not staring, not judging, not telling him to stop. She wasn't trying to control him. She was simply there. For the first time since the episode began, Lucas hesitated, suspended between panic and possibility. The lobby, with all its wealth and polish and rigid expectations, seemed to fall away. And in its place, on a cold marble floor, one overwhelmed child found another who understood what the world felt like when it became too much. The lobby did not breathe again right away. People remained frozen in place, caught between curiosity and discomfort, unsure whether they were witnessing a crisis or something deeply private. The chandelier still hummed softly above them. The polished marble floor was still cold, but the energy in the room had shifted, subtly yet unmistakably, like a storm losing its grip. Lucas sat on the floor now, no longer rocking violently. His knees were still pulled close to his chest, his shoulders tense, but his screams had dissolved into uneven breaths. His eyes, wide and glassy moments ago, were fixed on Annie's hands as they tapped against the marble. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm was simple, predictable. It did not rush him. It did not demand anything. Richard watched from only a few steps away, afraid to move, afraid to interrupt whatever fragile balance had formed. He had seen professionals try grounding techniques before weighted blankets, breathing exercises, scripted phrases delivered in calm, clinical voices. None of them had ever worked this quickly, or this quietly. Lucas swallowed hard. "It's still loud," he whispered, his voice thin and strained. Annie nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging something important. "I know," she said softly. "You don't have to stop it all at once." As she shifted slightly, careful not to make sudden movements, and tapped again. Same rhythm, same pace. Tap, 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 tap. "You can listen to this instead," she added. Just this. Lucas's breathing hitched, then gradually began to follow the beat. Not perfectly, not right away, but enough. Richard felt his chest tighten painfully. He had memorized charts, He had sat through endless consultations where people talked about his son instead of to him. He had learned how to advocate, how to push, how to pay for the best possible care. No one had ever told him that sometimes what Lucas needed most was not instruction but permission. If this moment moved you, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your voice matters here. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about truth, compassion, and quiet justice. Around them, the hotel staff shifted uneasily. The concierge took a half step forward, then stopped when the manager subtly raised a hand. A security guard leaned back against a column, uncertain. "Should we intervene?" Someone whispered. "No." Another voice murmured. "Just wait." Annie glanced up briefly, her eyes flicking toward the adults, then back to Lucas. Her expression tightened for just a second, not fear, but awareness. She was used to being watched, used to adults deciding what was best without asking. Lucas wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. His movements were jerky, restless, but no longer explosive. "Are they still looking at me?" he asked. Richard's heart broke at the question. Before he could answer, Annie spoke. "Some are," she said honestly. "But you don't have to look at them." She lifted one hand and pointed gently to the floor between them. "Look here, this spot." Lucas followed her finger. The marble had a faint vein running through it, gray against white, twisting like a small river frozen in stone. "It looks like a lightning bolt," Lucas said quietly. Annie smiled. "Just a little." "Yeah," she said. "I like that kind." Another breath passed, then another. Richard realized he had been holding his own breath without knowing it. He let it out slowly, afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment. "Thank you," he said softly, though he wasn't sure Annie could hear him. She did, but she didn't look at him. "Sometimes," Annie said to Lucas, "when it gets too much, I pretend I'm smaller than the noise." Lucas frowned. "How?" "I pick one thing," she explained. "One sound, or one picture. And I stay there until the rest gets tired." Lucas thought about that. He tapped his finger once against the floor, then again, mimicking her rhythm. "Tap, tap. It's not gone," he said. "It doesn't have to be," Annie replied. "Just quieter." "Is Dottie?" A few feet away, the manager cleared his throat. "Sir," he said to Richard, his voice measured but tense. "We need to consider the comfort of our other guests." Richard turned slowly, something hard and protective settling into place behind his eyes. "My son is not a disruption," he said quietly. "He's a child having a medical episode." The manager hesitated. "Of course, sir. We understand. But perhaps—" "No," Richard interrupted. Not loudly, not angrily, just firmly. "We're staying right here." There was something in his tone that ended the conversation. The manager nodded stiffly and stepped back. Annie's shoulders relaxed slightly. She had noticed the exchange, even if she pretended not to. Lucas leaned back onto his hands, testing his balance. His movements were still restless, but the frantic edge had dulled. He glanced up at Richard, eyes searching. "Daddy," he said, quieter now. "I don't like when they look at me like that." Richard lowered himself to one knee, careful to stay where he was, not crowding Lucas. "I know," he said. His voice wavered, and he didn't bother hiding it. "I'm sorry." Lucas frowned. "Why?" The question caught Richard off guard. "Because," he began, then stopped. He swallowed hard. "Because I should have helped sooner." Annie finally looked up at him then. Her gaze was not accusatory. It was thoughtful. "Sometimes grown-ups don't know how," she said simply. Richard met her eyes. "You do?" he asked. Annie shrugged. "Sometimes." A woman nearby let out a soft, embarrassed laugh. "Kids," she murmured to her companion. "They surprise you." Annie heard that too. She shifted her weight and glanced toward the elevators, checking instinctively, as if worried her mother might appear and see her sitting on the floor of the lobby. Trouble always came easier to people like them. Lucas followed her gaze. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. Annie shook her head quickly. "No, I'm just waiting." "For who?" "My mom," she said. "She works here." Lucas nodded, accepting this as an important fact. "My dad works everywhere," he said. Annie considered that. "That sounds tiring." Richard almost smiled. A soft chime sounded as an elevator arrived. A few guests stepped out, slowing when they noticed the unusual scene. A well-dressed man kneeling on the floor, his son seated beside a small black girl, all of them framed by expensive marble and silent onlookers. But Lucas didn't react this time. He stayed where he was. Annie tapped the floor one last time, then stopped. "You're doing good," she said. "Your body's catching up." Lucas took a deep breath. Then another. The storm had not disappeared, but it had passed its worst point, and for the first time that evening, Richard allowed himself to believe that this moment, this strange, unplanned moment on a hotel floor, might matter more than any carefully constructed plan he had ever paid for. The quiet held, fragile but real. Lucas sat on the marble floor beside Annie, his legs stretched out now instead of pulled tight to his chest. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching occasionally, like they were still deciding whether the danger had truly passed. His breathing wasn't smooth yet, but it was no longer panicked. Each breath had space around it. Tap, tap. Annie tapped twice more, then stopped. Lucas noticed immediately. His head lifted. "Why'd you stop?" he asked, a faint edge of worry creeping back into his voice. Annie smiled at him, small and reassuring. "Because you're doing it yourself now." Lucas blinked. "I am?" She nodded. "You don't need my tapping anymore. Your body figured it out." Lucas tested that idea. He took a slow breath in, then let it out. It felt strange, like balancing on one foot, but it worked. "Oh," he said again, quieter this time. Richard watched the exchange with an ache he couldn't name. He stayed where he was, half kneeling, afraid that standing fully upright would somehow break the spell. He had never seen Lucas calm himself like this, without tools, without instructions, without pressure. The lobby had not returned to normal. Not quite. People still lingered at the edges, pretending to scroll on their phones while sneaking glances. The hotel staff hovered with professional unease, unsure whether this moment would end in relief or complaint. Lucas glanced up at Annie again, studying her face as if really seeing her for the first time. "What's your name?" he asked. Annie hesitated. It was a small pause. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but Richard did. It was the pause of a child who had learned that names could invite questions, and questions could invite trouble. "Still," she answered. "My name's Annie," she said. Lucas smiled immediately, like the answer pleased him more than he'd expected. "I'm Lucas. I know," Annie replied. Lucas looked surprised. "You do?" "Your dad kept saying it," she said matter-of-factly. Richard felt a flicker of embarrassment. He opened his mouth to apologize for not introducing them properly, then stopped. Annie didn't seem offended. If anything, she seemed used to adults forgetting the formalities when it came to children like her. "I like your name," Lucas said. Annie considered that. "I like yours too." "What does Annie mean?" Lucas asked. She shrugged. "My mom says it means grace. I don't really know what that is." Lucas thought hard. "Is it like when you don't get mad, even though you could?" Annie's eyes softened. "Yeah," she said. "I think it's like that." Richard felt his throat tighten. A woman near the elevators whispered to her husband, "That little girl is something else." Annie heard it. She always heard it. Her shoulders tensed slightly, the instinct to retreat flickering again. Lucas noticed. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Annie said quickly. "You're not shaking anymore," Lucas observed. Annie looked at her hands, then back at him. "I don't shake like you do," she said gently. "But sometimes my stomach feels twisty when people look." Lucas nodded seriously. "My chest feels like it's buzzing." "That too," Annie said. "Buzzing is bad." Richard shifted his weight, the word people look echoing in his mind. He saw, suddenly, how familiar this was to her, how practiced, how unfair. "Annie," he said carefully, testing her name aloud for the first time. "Thank you." She looked up at him, really looked. "For what?" she asked. "For seeing my son," Richard said. "Not the noise. Him." Annie studied his face, weighing something silently. "I always see kids first," she said. "Grown-ups don't like that." Richard let out a quiet, humorless breath. "They should." Lucas leaned closer to Annie, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Do you come here a lot?" "Every week," she said. "My mom works." Lucas nodded. "My dad works everywhere." Annie smiled at that, a little crooked. "That sounds lonely." Richard almost laughed, then stopped himself when he realized she wasn't joking. Before he could respond, a hotel manager approached again, his expression carefully neutral. "Sir," he said to Richard, "we've received complaints." Richard stood up slowly this time, fully, his posture straight but controlled. "My son had a medical episode," he repeated. "He is recovering. If that's a problem, we'll remember it." The manager hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Of course, sir." As he stepped away, Annie exhaled quietly, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You don't have to do that," she said to Richard. "Do what?" "Get mad at them," she said. "They always do that." Richard crouched again so he was level with her. "I'm not mad," he said. "I'm done pretending it's okay." "Actually," Annie tilted her head, considering him. "That's different." "Yes," Richard said. "It is." A familiar squeak echoed from across the lobby, the wheels of a housekeeping cart. Annie's head snapped up. "My mom," she said, already rising to her feet. A woman in a light blue uniform approached, slowing when she saw her daughter standing with a well-dressed man and a child seated on the floor. Fear crossed her face instantly. "Annie?" she said softly but urgently. "What are you doing?" Annie straightened. "I was helping." Her mother's eyes flicked to Lucas, then to Richard. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "She knows she's not supposed to." "She helped my son," Richard interrupted gently. "She helped him more than anyone else." The woman froze. Lucas stood up too, wobbling slightly before steadying himself. "She helped me," he said. "I was buzzing." Annie's mother looked down at her daughter, then back at Lucas. Something softened in her expression, pride mixing with caution. "We should go," she said to Annie, not unkindly. "My break's almost over." Annie nodded, then turned back to Lucas. "It was nice to meet you," she said. "Lucas." He clutched the small cleaning cloth she had given him earlier, fingers curling around it. "It was nice to meet you too," he said. Annie, hearing her name from him, made her smile. As Annie walked away with her mother, disappearing into the rhythm of the hotel's back corridors, Richard felt an unfamiliar certainty settle in his chest. Lucas watched her until she was gone. "She didn't think I was bad," he said quietly. Richard knelt in front of him, resting his hands on his son's shoulders. "No," he said. "She didn't. I teens with 2,000. And for the first time, Richard wondered how many times the world had failed that little girl, and how many times she had learned to carry grace anyway. The lobby slowly returned to motion. But it was not the same motion as before. People resumed walking, voices lowered. Suitcases rolled again across the marble floor. Yet something lingered in the air, an aftertaste of discomfort mixed with quiet awe. A few guests stole glances at Lucas as they passed, but most of them looked away faster than before, as if suddenly aware of their own staring. Lucas stood close to his father now, the small cleaning cloth Annie had given him clenched in his fist. He rubbed it between his fingers, back and forth, grounding himself in the texture. The buzzing in his chest had not disappeared completely, but it had softened, like a storm moving farther out to sea. Richard straightened his jacket, a reflex more than a necessity. He felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with appearances. For the first time in a long while, people had seen something he usually managed to contain behind closed doors. They had seen his son. "Are we leaving?" Lucas asked quietly. Richard looked down at him. "Do you want to?" Lucas hesitated. He glanced toward the elevators, then toward the long stretch of windows that looked out onto the city street. Cars moved below, their headlights blinking on as dusk crept in. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm tired." Richard nodded. "That makes sense." He placed a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder. Not gripping, not guiding, just there. Lucas leaned into the touch without thinking, his body accepting it, now that the danger had passed. They began walking slowly toward a quieter seating area near the windows. With each step, Richard noticed how carefully his son moved, as if testing the world to see whether it would suddenly grow too loud again. A bellhop passed by and offered a polite nod, his eyes flicking briefly to Lucas's hands, then away. No comment. No judgment spoken aloud. That, Richard realized, was progress, however small. They reached a pair of low chairs set slightly apart from the main flow of traffic. Richard sat, and Lucas climbed up beside him, curling his legs underneath himself. Outside, the city hummed in the distance, a sound softened by thick glass. Richard exhaled slowly. He had handled mergers that reshaped entire industries. He had negotiated contracts worth more money than he could ever spend in a lifetime. None of that had prepared him for the way his hands were still trembling now. "Daddy?" Lucas asked. "Yes. Was I bad?" The question was quiet, careful, the kind of question that carried old weight. Richard felt it land squarely in his chest. "No," he said immediately. "You were overwhelmed." Lucas frowned. "People don't like it when I'm like that." Today, Richard chose his words carefully. "Some people don't understand it, and some people are afraid of things they don't understand." Lucas looked down at the cloth in his hand. Annie wasn't afraid. "No," Richard agreed. "She wasn't." Lucas was silent for a moment, then asked, "Will I see her again?" The question caught Richard off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. "But maybe." Lucas nodded, accepting the uncertainty. He rubbed the cloth once more, then tucked it carefully into the pocket of his hoodie. Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting to the reflection of them both in the window. He barely recognized the man staring back at him, not because he looked different, but because something inside him had shifted. For years, he had treated Lucas's condition like a problem to be solved, something to manage, to minimize, to keep from disrupting carefully curated environments. He had paid experts to help him build walls around his son's differences, and then a 6-year-old girl, sitting on a marble floor, had dismantled those walls without even trying. Richard closed his eyes briefly. He thought of Annie's calm voice, her certainty, the way she had seen Lucas not as a spectacle, but as a child fighting something invisible. How many times had she done that before? How many times had she learned to read people's pain because no one ever slowed down to read hers? A memory surfaced, uninvited, his own childhood, sitting stiffly beside his father at formal dinners, learning early that discomfort was weakness and emotions were liabilities. He had learned to swallow everything that didn't fit the image. Lucas, he realized, had never been given that option. His emotions refused to be swallowed. They demanded space, and maybe that wasn't a flaw. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sir." Richard opened his eyes to see the hotel manager standing a respectful distance away, hands clasped in front of him. His expression was carefully neutral, but something like caution flickered beneath it. "Yes?" Richard said. "I wanted to apologize," the manager began, "for how the situation was handled earlier." Richard studied him. "Go on." Reported, "We aim to provide a comfortable environment for all our guests," the manager said. "And sometimes, we focus too much on appearances." Richard didn't respond right away. "My son isn't an appearance," he said finally. "He's a person." The manager nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "Understood." After a brief pause, he added, "If there's anything you need, a quieter area, assistance, we're fine," Richard said. "But thank you." The manager inclined his head and walked away. Lucas watched him go. He was nicer that time. He was. Richard agreed. Lucas leaned back against the chair. Annie said grown-ups don't know how sometimes. Richard let out a short, surprised laugh. She might be right. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the city lights growing brighter outside as evening settled in. Richard checked his watch absently, then realized it no longer mattered what time it was. What mattered was the boy beside him, calmer now, present, and the girl who had made that possible. Across the lobby, unseen by most, Annie and her mother disappeared into the service elevator. The doors slid shut quietly, carrying them upward, back into a world that rarely noticed when they moved through it. But Richard noticed, and he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that this encounter was not something he would forget or allow to fade into a story told once and set aside. It was a beginning. That night, Lucas slept with the lights on. Richard noticed it only after he had finished changing into his pajamas and was halfway through pulling the blanket up to his son's chin. The bedside lamp cast a soft yellow glow across the room, catching on the edges of the furniture. turning shadows into gentle shapes instead of threats. "You want me to turn it off?" Richard asked quietly. Lucas shook his head, already clutching the worn cleaning cloth in one hand. "Can it stay on?" "Of course," Richard said without hesitation. He sat on the edge of the bed longer than usual, listening to the rhythm of Lucas's breathing as it gradually slowed. The hotel room was silent in a way the lobby never had been. Thick carpets, heavy curtains, insulation designed to keep the outside world at bay. This was the kind of quiet Richard had paid for countless times, and yet, his mind refused to settle. As Lucas drifted towards sleep, his eyes fluttering closed and open again, he murmured, "Daddy?" "Yes, buddy. Annie's name means grace," Lucas said. "That's a good name." Richard smiled faintly. "It is." Lucas nodded, satisfied, and finally fell asleep. The cloth tucked beneath his chin like a talisman. Richard stayed there, watching his son, until the rise and fall of his chest evened out completely. Only then did he stand and move toward the window. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, lights blinking, traffic flowing, people moving with purpose toward destinations that felt suddenly irrelevant. He pressed his forehead lightly against the cool glass. He had replayed the scene in the lobby over and over since it happened. Lucas's screams, the staring, his own paralysis, and then Annie, stepping forward without fear, without permission. A 6-year-old girl had done what years of experience, training, and money had not. Richard's phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen. 3 missed messages from his assistant. 2 emails flagged urgent. A reminder for a call with investors in the morning. He silenced it. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the usual anxiety that followed such a decision. The world could wait a few hours. His son could not. The next morning, Richard woke early. He moved quietly through the suite, careful not to disturb Lucas, and made himself a cup of coffee using the small machine near the kitchenette. The bitter smell grounded him. He stood there, mug in hand, staring at nothing, when a thought surfaced that made him pause. He didn't know Annie's last name. He didn't know where she lived, what school she went to, or how often she sat on benches waiting for her mother to finish cleaning rooms in buildings like this one, and that felt wrong. When Lucas woke, he was groggy but calm. The meltdown from the night before seemed distant now, like a bad dream that still left a faint ache behind. "Did I scare you?" Lucas asked as they ate breakfast, scrambled eggs for him, untouched toast for Richard. Richard set his fork down. "No," he said honestly. "You worried me. But you didn't scare me." Lucas poked at his eggs. "People looked at me like I was scary." Richard nodded slowly. "Sometimes people mistake things they don't understand for danger." Lucas frowned. "Is Annie dangerous?" "No," Richard said firmly. "Annie is brave." Lucas smiled at that. After breakfast, Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. "Do you want to go downstairs?" he asked. Lucas froze. "The lobby?" "Yes," Richard said gently. "We don't have to stay long, and we can leave any time you want." Lucas hesitated, fingers tightening around the cloth in his pocket. "What if it gets loud again?" "Then we'll handle it," Richard replied. Together, they took the elevator down mid-morning, when the lobby was quieter than the night before but still alive. As the doors slid open, Lucas stiffened, then took a careful breath. "I'm okay," he said, more to himself than to Richard. Richard let him lead the way out. The lobby looked the same, polished, pristine, indifferent. But Richard felt different moving through it now. More aware, less insulated. He scanned the room instinctively, searching for a small figure near the walls. A worn backpack, familiar braids. Nothing. "Daddy," Lucas said softly. "She's not here." Richard nodded. "She might be working somewhere else today." Lucas absorbed that quietly. They sat near the windows again. Not because Richard needed the quiet, but because it felt like the right place. A few guests passed by. Some glanced at Lucas. Most didn't. "Progress," Richard thought again. A woman pushing a housekeeping cart moved across the far side of the lobby. Richard's attention sharpened immediately, though he knew better than to jump to conclusions. When she turned, he saw that it wasn't Annie's mother. Disappointment surprised him with its force. He was still processing that feeling when a voice behind him said, "Sir?" Richard turned. It was the concierge from the night before, his posture polite but cautious. "I spoke with my supervisor," the man said. "About yesterday." Richard waited. "We wanted to let you know that we're reviewing our staff training," the concierge continued, "especially regarding guests with special needs." Richard studied him. "Why?" The man shifted slightly. "Because what happened yesterday shouldn't have escalated the way it did." Richard thought of Annie sitting on the floor, calm and steady, while trained adults stood frozen. "That's a start," he said. The concierge nodded, relieved, and moved away. Lucas watched the exchange. "Are they learning?" he asked. "I hope so," Richard replied. They stayed in the lobby longer than Richard had planned, not because Lucas needed to acclimate, but because Richard needed to observe. He noticed how easily the environment dismissed certain people and elevated others, how invisible labor kept everything running, how children like Annie learned early to read rooms adults never questioned. He felt a quiet anger settle beneath his ribs, not explosive, not loud, but focused. This wasn't just about his son. It never had been. As they prepared to leave for the day, Lucas tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy?" "Yes?" "If I see Annie again," Lucas said, serious, "I want to say thank you better." Richard smiled. "I think she already knows." Lucas shook his head. "I want to tell her my name again, so she doesn't forget." Richard felt something twist warmly in his chest. "She won't forget you," he said, but he already knew the truth. Neither would he. The afternoon light slanted through the hotel windows, softening the sharp lines of the lobby. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, visible only where the sun caught them just right. From his seat near the glass, Richard watched people come and go, business travelers with rolling suitcases, couples dressed for lunch, staff moving with practiced efficiency. Lucas sat beside him, swinging his legs gently, the cleaning cloth still tucked safely into his pocket. He wasn't gripping it anymore. That, Richard noticed, felt like progress. "You're doing really well," Richard said. Lucas shrugged. "It's quieter now." "Yes," Richard agreed. "It is." They stayed a little longer than planned. Not because Lucas needed more time, but because Richard did. He was beginning to see the lobby not as a polished space designed for comfort, but as a stage where invisible rules decided who belonged and who didn't. A bell chimed as the service elevator opened on the far side of the room. Richard's attention sharpened immediately. Annie stepped out first, her small backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked tired now, the calm confidence from the night before, replaced with the subdued patience of a child who had spent hours waiting quietly. Behind her came her mother, pushing a housekeeping cart, her shoulders slightly hunched from long hours of work. Lucas noticed her at the same time. "Daddy," he whispered urgently. "It's Annie." Richard stood without thinking. For a brief second, Annie didn't see them. She was focused on tying one loose strap on her backpack, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finally looked up and spotted Lucas, her face changed instantly, surprise flickering into a shy smile. "Hi," she said. Lucas froze, then remembered himself. He straightened, heart pounding, and took a step forward. "Hi," he said back. I wanted to say thank you again." Annie nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable thing to say. "You're welcome." Her mother noticed them now, her expression tightening with instinctive concern. "Annie," she said softly, "we need to keep moving." "It's okay," Richard said quickly, careful to keep his voice respectful, non-threatening. "I just wanted to thank your daughter properly." Annie's mother studied him for a moment, the expensive suit, the controlled posture, the practiced calm, and then looked down at her daughter. "What did you do, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Annie shifted her weight. "I helped him breathe," she said simply. Lucas nodded eagerly. "She did. She helped my brain slow down." Annie's mother blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. Richard stepped closer, lowering himself slightly so he wasn't towering over them. "My name is Richard Coleman," he said. "This is my son, Lucas." Annie's mother hesitated, then nodded. "I'm Maria," she said. "This is my daughter, Annie." "I know," Richard said with a small smile. "She introduced herself yesterday." Maria's eyebrows lifted in surprise. She has a gift, Richard continued. And I don't say that lightly. Maria's instinct was to deflect. Years of experience had taught her that praise from people like this often came with expectations or consequences. She's just a kid, Maria said carefully. So is my son, Richard replied. And yesterday, she treated him like one when the rest of us failed to. Things remonted. Maria looked down at Annie. Something complicated moving behind her eyes, pride, worry, protectiveness. Annie tugged lightly on her mother's sleeve. Mama, it's okay, she said. They're nice. Maria sighed quietly. We're on our way out, she said to Richard. My shift just ended. Richard nodded. Of course, I won't keep you. Lucas glanced between them, then blurted out. Can I give her something? Richard looked down at him. What did you have in mind? Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out the cleaning cloth. He hesitated, then held it out toward Annie. You gave this to me, he said. It helped. I want you to have something too, but I don't really have anything. Annie looked at the cloth, then back at Lucas. She shook her head gently. You keep it, she said. It's yours now. Lucas frowned, thinking hard. Then his eyes brightened. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small plastic race car blue, chipped along one side, clearly well loved. This is my favorite, he said seriously. It goes really fast, but sometimes it needs to stop. Annie smiled, touched despite herself. That sounds like you. He grinned. Yeah. She took the car carefully, turning it over in her hands. Thank you. Maria's throat tightened as she watched the exchange. She placed a hand on Annie's shoulder. We really should go, she said softly. Before they turned away, Richard spoke again. Maria, he said, if it's all right, I'd like to talk sometime. About Annie, about what she did. Maria stiffened. She didn't do anything wrong. I know, Richard said quickly. That's not what I mean. He paused, choosing his words with care. I spend a lot of time around people who believe solutions come from titles and training, he continued. Yesterday, your daughter reminded me that understanding doesn't always come from either. Maria studied him for a long moment. You don't have to fix everything, she said finally. Sometimes kids just need someone to see them. Richard nodded. I'm starting to understand that. Annie tugged gently on her mother's hand. Can we go now? Yes, baby, Maria said. As they turned to leave, Lucas called out. Annie? She looked back. I won't forget your name, he said earnestly. Annie smiled, her eyes warm. I won't forget yours either, Lucas. They walked away together. Annie's small hand tucked into her mother's, the blue race car peeking out from her fingers. Richard watched until they disappeared through the revolving doors. Lucas leaned against him, quiet now, thoughtful. She's my friend, he said. Richard rested a hand on his son's head. Yes, he said. She is. And as they stood there, father and son framed by glass and light, Richard felt certain of one thing. This was no longer just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of a responsibility he could not, and would not, walk away from. The drive away from the hotel was quiet. Not the uneasy silence Richard had grown accustomed to after difficult moments, but a thoughtful one like both of them were still holding something fragile, afraid that speaking too loudly might break it. Lucas sat in the back seat. His sneakers kicked off, knees pulled up loosely as he watched the city slide past the window. The blue race car Annie had given him rested in his lap. He rolled it back and forth along the seam of the seat, slow and deliberate. Daddy, he said after a while. Yes? Do you think Annie gets tired of helping people? The question caught Richard off guard. I don't know, he admitted. Why do you ask? Lucas shrugged. She helps like it's normal, but it looks like work. Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the observation landing heavier than he expected. Sometimes, he said carefully, people learn to help because no one helped them first. Lucas thought about that. That doesn't seem fair. No, Richard said. It isn't. They stopped at a red light. Richard glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His own eyes looked older somehow. Not tired. Awake. He dropped Lucas off at home with the sitter and drove straight to his office downtown, though his heart wasn't in it. The building rose clean and sharp against the sky, glass and steel reflecting authority. Normally, stepping inside grounded him. Today, it felt hollow. Mr. Coleman? His assistant greeted him as he stepped off the elevator. We need your approval on the Boston acquisition, and the board call has been moved up to cancel it, Richard said. She blinked. Sir, postpone it, he corrected. Tell them I'll reschedule. A pause. Is everything all right? Richard thought of Annie sitting on the marble floor, of Maria's instinctive fear, of how easily a child had been dismissed, and how easily he himself had once dismissed people like her. No, he said honestly. But it will be. He went into his office and closed the door. For a long moment, he stood there, staring out at the city. Then, he pressed the intercom. Can you get me the hotel's HR policies? He asked his assistant, specifically regarding staff children on site. Another pause. I'll look into it. And one more thing, Richard added. I need the name of the cleaning supervisor on the evening shift. His assistant hesitated. May I ask why? Because, Richard said, his voice steady. I think we need to talk about who gets protected and who doesn't. That evening, after Lucas was asleep, Richard sat alone at the kitchen table, a legal pad in front of him. He hadn't written on paper in years, everything lived on screens now, but this felt like something that needed weight. He wrote Annie at the top of the page, then Maria, then, slowly, deliberately, he began listing questions instead of solutions. What happens to children who grow up watching their parents disappear into service elevators? Who teaches them emotional intelligence when no one has time to teach them safety? How many Annies learn to be calm because chaos is not an option? He set the pen down, unsettled. For years, he had donated millions to education initiatives, mental health programs, innovation hubs. He had believed that scale was the answer, that impact came from size. And yet, the most meaningful intervention he had witnessed all year had cost nothing. No grant, no committee, no approval, just attention. The next morning, Richard walked Lucas to school himself. It wasn't something he usually did. Schedules, drivers, meetings, it was easier to delegate. But when Lucas reached for his hand at the crosswalk, Richard felt a quiet conviction settle in his chest. You're holding my hand too tight, Lucas said. Richard loosened his grip immediately. Sorry. Axes. It's okay, Lucas said. Just don't squeeze. I won't, Richard promised. At school pickup that afternoon, Lucas climbed into the car buzzing with stories about a science experiment, about a classmate who talked too much, about how his teacher said race cars needed brakes. Richard listened more than he spoke. When they got home, Lucas surprised him. Daddy, he said, can Annie come over someday? The question was casual, but the hope beneath it was unmistakable. I don't know, Richard said honestly. But if she can, I'd like that. Lucas nodded, satisfied. That night, after Lucas went to bed, Richard made a call he had been putting off for years. David, a familiar voice answered. What's this about? Mark, Richard said. I need a favor. A pause. That depends. I want to review our philanthropic portfolio, Richard continued. Specifically, where it intersects with labor, childcare, and special needs. Mark exhaled slowly. That's broad. So is the problem, Richard replied. Another pause. Then, what happened? Richard thought of Annie again. Of her calm voice. Of the way she had said, I always see kids first. I met someone who reminded me what we keep missing, he said. The next day, Richard returned to the hotel alone. He dressed down, no tie, no watch that screamed money. It wasn't disguise. It was intention. The lobby looked the same. It always would. But Richard walked through it differently now, noticing things he had once filtered out. The tired eyes behind polite smiles, the subtle way staff avoided being noticed, the unspoken hierarchy that decided who could sit and who could not. He asked for the cleaning supervisor. The woman who came forward looked wary, her posture already defensive. I just want to talk, Richard said gently. No one's in trouble. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded. My name is Richard Coleman, he said. I was here a few nights ago. With my son. Recognition flickered across her face. I wanted to ask about one of your employees, Richard continued. Maria, and her daughter. The supervisor's shoulders tightened. She didn't break any rules, she said quickly. Her daughter was just waiting. I know, Richard interrupted. And I think that matters. The woman studied him carefully now. What are you asking, sir? Richard chose his words with care. I'm asking what it would take, he said, to make sure a child like Annie doesn't have to learn calm before she learns safety. The supervisor didn't answer right away, but she didn't walk away either. And Richard knew, with quiet certainty, that whatever came next would not be easy, but it would be necessary. Richard did not announce himself when he entered the hotel that afternoon. He stood just inside the revolving doors for a moment, letting the space absorb him instead of the other way around. The lobby was busier than it had been the day before. Conference guests clustered near the bar. A wedding party drifted past in coordinated outfits, laughter spilling louder than it should have in a place designed to sound expensive. No one screamed this time. No one stared. And yet, Richard felt the same unease crawl up his spine. He adjusted the collar of his open shirt, not designer casual, just deliberately plain, and scanned the room with a different set of eyes than he once would have used. He noticed who moved freely and who hugged the edges, who sat and who stood, who was allowed to take up space. Near the far wall, beside a service hallway marked employees only, Maria stood speaking quietly with another woman in uniform. Her shoulders were tense, her hands clasped together at her waist. Annie was not with her. Richard waited. He had learned enough in the last 48 hours to know that barging in even with good intentions could do more harm than good. Power announced itself whether he wanted it to or not. When Maria finished speaking and turned away from the hallway, Richard stepped forward. Maria, he said, keeping his voice low. She froze. Slowly, she turned around. Recognition flashing across her face, followed immediately by caution. The kind that came from years of learning that attention from people like him rarely ended well. Yes? She asked, carefully neutral. My name is Richard, he said again, though they had already been introduced. We spoke briefly the other day. About your daughter. Maria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She didn't do anything wrong, she said quickly. She knows the rules. She was just waiting. I know, Richard said gently. That's why I'm here. Maria studied him, searching for the hidden angle. When she didn't find it immediately, she folded her arms not defensively, but protectively. I'm on my break, she said. I don't have much time. I won't take much, Richard promised. And if at any point you want to stop this conversation, we stop. That gave her pause. All right, she said finally. Talk. Alove. They moved a few steps to the side, near a tall plant that offered the illusion of privacy. The noise of the lobby dulled slightly there, replaced by the low hum of air conditioning. I wanted to tell you something first, Richard began. What your daughter did for my son, it mattered, more than you probably realize. Maria's eyes flicked away. She's good with kids, she said. Always has been. She's exceptional, Richard corrected. And she shouldn't have to hide that. Workin' towns, Maria let out a short, humorless breath. You say that now. Richard didn't argue. He nodded instead. You're right, he said. People say a lot of things when it's convenient. That honesty surprised her. She looked back at him more directly this time. So why are you really here? She asked. Richard considered his answer carefully. Because I realized something, he said. My son has resources. Protection. Advocates. Even when the world fails him, there's a safety net underneath. Day. Maria's expression didn't change, but something sharpened behind her eyes. And my daughter? She asked. That's what I'm trying to understand, Richard said. What happens when a child like Annie grows up learning how to manage everyone else's emotions before anyone ever manages hers? Maria was quiet for a long moment. She learns to be careful, Maria said finally. She learns when to speak and when not to. She learns how to calm people down so they don't get angry. Equaled. Her voice softened. She shouldn't have to be that good at 6 years old. No, Richard said. She shouldn't. Maria studied him again, weighing his words against her experience. Are you offering something? She asked bluntly. Richard didn't flinch. Eventually, maybe, he said. But not today. Today, I'm listening. That seemed to catch her off guard more than any check or promise would have. My supervisor called me in this morning. Maria said quietly. Asked why my daughter was on the floor with a guest's child. Asked if I understood policy. Richard felt a flash of anger, quick and hot, then forced it down. What did you say? He asked. I said my daughter was helping, Maria replied. And that if that was against policy, maybe the policy was wrong. A faint smile touched Richard's mouth. That was brave. It was necessary, Maria said. I can't teach Annie to stand up for others if I don't do it myself. Richard nodded slowly. You shouldn't have had to. Maria looked past him, toward the center of the lobby where guests laughed and posed for photos, unaware of the invisible negotiations happening just beyond their view. People like you, she said carefully. You get to choose when something matters. Richard absorbed that without protest. Yes, he said. And that choice has consequences. They stood there in silence for a moment. Then Maria sighed. She's waiting in the staff lounge, she said. I didn't want her sitting out here today. Richard's heart lifted slightly. Is she okay? She's fine, Maria said, drawing. She brought that little blue car home last night like it was treasure. Richard smiled. Lucas was worried she might forget him. Maria's expression softened despite herself. She didn't, she said. She asked if his brain felt quieter this morning. Richard felt something settle in his chest, warm and heavy all at once. Maria, he said, I don't want to make promises I can't keep. But I do want to ask you something. She met his gaze steadily. Ask, if there were a way, Richard said slowly, for Annie to be supported for who she is, not as a problem, not as a favor, but as a child with something valuable to offer. Would you want that? Maria hesitated. Then, cautiously, she nodded. Yes, she said, as long as it doesn't cost her safety. Richard held her gaze. That's the only thing that matters. A voice crackled over the intercom, calling staff back to duty. That's my cue, Maria said. Thank you for talking to me, Richard said. She paused before turning away. Just don't turn this into a story about yourself, she said quietly. Richard nodded. I won't. As she walked back toward the service hallway, Richard stayed where he was, watching the flow of the lobby with new clarity. This was the pushback he had expected. The discomfort, the lines drawn quietly but firmly in the sand. Change, he realized, didn't announce itself with grand gestures. It began here, in conversations no one else saw, in choices that made people uneasy, and he was no longer willing to look away. The staff lounge was quieter than the lobby, but it carried its own kind of tension. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A vending machine blinked patiently in the corner, offering sodas and snacks that most of the employees rarely bought. Metal lockers lined one wall, dented and scarred from years of use. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and reheated food. Annie sat at a small table near the window, her feet tucked under the chair. A sheet of paper lay in front of her, covered with uneven crayon lines. Blue and green streaks crossed each other again and again, looping in patterns that only made sense to her. She was drawing the lobby, not the chandelier or the marble floor, but the space between people, the empty air where noise felt louder, the corner where she had sat the day before, the spot on the floor where Lucas's hands had pressed flat as he tried to breathe. She pressed the blue crayon down harder, then stopped, sensing someone behind her. Annie, her mother said softly. Annie looked up. Is it time to go home? Soon, Maria replied. I just wanted to check on you. Annie nodded and went back to her drawing. Mama? Yes, baby. Did I get you in trouble? Maria's chest tightened. No, she said firmly. You didn't. Annie glanced up, searching her mother's face the way she always did when she needed to be sure. Maria knelt beside her chair so they were eye to eye. You helped someone, Maria continued. That's not trouble. Annie hesitated. Some people looked mad. Maria brushed a stray braid away from her daughter's face. Some people don't like it when things don't go the way they expect. Annie thought about that. Lucas didn't like it either, she said. But he was scared, not mad. Maria nodded. You noticed that? Annie shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. It's easy to tell when someone's scared. Maria straightened slowly. Easy for you, she thought. Because you've had to learn. A knock sounded softly at the open doorway. Maria turned, instinctively tensing again. When she saw Richard standing there, hands visible, posture careful, she felt the familiar clash of emotions: gratitude, suspicion, exhaustion. "I hope it's all right," Richard said quietly. "I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to say hello." "I really dime." Maria glanced at Annie, then back at him. 5 minutes, she said. Richard nodded. "That's more than enough." Annie turned around in her chair, eyes widening slightly when she recognized him. "Hi," she said. "Hi, Annie," Richard replied, using her name deliberately. "I hope I'm not bothering you." Annie shook her head. "I'm drawing. May I see?" Richard asked, not stepping closer unless invited. She hesitated, then slid the paper toward him. Richard crouched to look, careful not to comment too quickly. He saw the shapes, the overlapping colors, the way certain areas were darker, pressed harder. "What's this part?" he asked, pointing to a cluster of blue lines near the center. "That's where it got loud," Annie said matter-of-factly. "And this?" he asked, pointing to a small, clear space she had left untouched. "That's where it got quiet," she said. When Lucas started breathing slower, Richard swallowed. "You remembered that," he said. Annie nodded. It was important. Maria watched the exchange closely. Richard wasn't trying to lead Annie anywhere. He wasn't praising her excessively or framing her as something extraordinary. He was listening. That mattered. "Lucas wanted me to tell you something," Richard said gently. Annie looked up. "What?" "He said he hopes you don't forget him," Richard replied, "and that his brain felt quieter this morning." Annie smiled. A small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I didn't forget him," she said. "And that's good." Maria crossed her arms, studying Richard more carefully now. "You came back," she said. "Yes," Richard admitted. "I needed to." "To feel better?" Maria asked, not unkindly. "No," Richard said. "To do better." Annie swung her legs slowly beneath the table. "Are you going to make the hotel quieter?" she asked. The question was innocent. The answer was not. Richard paused. "I don't know if I can make it quieter," he said honestly. "But I can make it kinder." Annie considered that. "Kinder helps," she said. Maria exhaled softly. "Annie," she said, "go get your backpack. We're leaving in a few minutes." Annie nodded and slid off the chair. As she passed Richard, she stopped. "You did good too," she told him seriously. Richard blinked. "I did. You didn't make it worse," Annie said. "Some grown-ups do." Then she walked away. Maria closed her eyes briefly, letting out a breath she'd been holding for years. "She's honest," she said quietly. "She's wise," Richard replied. Maria met his gaze. "Those aren't always the same thing." Richard nodded. "I'm learning that." They stood there in the narrow doorway of the staff lounge, the distance between their worlds smaller than it had ever been, and yet still full of invisible lines. "Listen," Maria said, lowering her voice. "If you want to help, really help, you need to understand something." "I'm listening," Richard said. "This place," she continued, "it runs because people like me don't make noise. We clean, we fix, we disappear. And our kids learn to disappear too." Richard felt the weight of her words settle. "I don't want Annie disappearing," Maria said, "but I also can't afford for her to be noticed the wrong way." "I understand," Richard said, "and I won't move without your permission." "I must." Maria studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "That's a start," she said. Annie returned with her backpack, slipping her hand into her mother's automatically. "We're going home," Maria told her. Annie looked at Richard. "Bye." "Goodbye, Annie," he said. "Thank you for letting me see your drawing." She smiled and walked away with her mother, the door closing softly behind them. Richard stayed where he was for a moment after they left. He felt the familiar urge to act quickly, to draft plans, to call teams, to build something big enough to prove his sincerity. He resisted it. Change didn't begin with momentum. It began with restraint. As he walked back through the lobby, guests passed him without a second glance. The marble floor gleamed. The chandelier sparkled. Everything looked exactly as it had before. But Richard knew better now. Because somewhere between a staff lounge and a child's drawing, He had crossed a line he could never uncross, and he was finally ready to face what came next. The meeting room on the 34th floor was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city like a throne above a kingdom. The table was long, polished, flawless, no fingerprints, no clutter. A dozen leather chairs stood in perfect alignment, waiting for people who were used to being listened to. Richard Coleman sat at the head of the table, hands folded, expression unreadable. Across from him, the board members shifted in their seats. They had expected numbers, a proposal, a strategic pivot tied to profit or reputation. They had not expected silence. "Richard," one of them finally said, clearing his throat, "you asked for this emergency session. We've all rearranged schedules. What's this about?" Richard looked at them one by one. Men and women who had made fortunes by predicting risk, by optimizing systems, by removing inefficiency. People who believed compassion could be outsourced and morality summarized in bullet points. "I want to talk about liability," Richard said calmly. Several of them straightened, suddenly alert. "That's our language," another member said dryly. "Yes," Richard replied. "And we've been using it wrong." A murmur moved around the table. Richard stood and walked to the window, his back to them for a moment. The city below pulsed with life. Cars, people, noise. Somewhere down there, Annie was probably walking home with her mother, backpack heavy, steps careful. "We spend millions protecting this company from lawsuits," he continued. "From bad press, from exposure. We build systems to reduce visible risk." He turned back to face them. "But we ignore the quiet ones." A woman near the end of the table frowned. "You'll need to be more specific." "I was at a hotel we partner with," Richard said. "My son had a neurological episode in the lobby." Several heads nodded politely. Some already knew news like that traveled discreetly in their circles. "A 6-year-old girl helped him," Richard continued. "She did what trained staff didn't. She regulated him, grounded him, saw him." Silence. "She is black," Richard added. "Her mother cleans rooms." That landed. One man shifted uncomfortably. And that child has more emotional intelligence than most of the leadership programs we fund," Richard said. "But she is invisible to our systems." The woman frowned deeper. "Are you suggesting we hire children?" "No," Richard said flatly. "I'm suggesting we stop pretending that value only comes with credentials." Another board member leaned forward. "Richard, this is sounding personal." "It is," Richard agreed. "That's the problem. We've designed everything to be impersonal." He sat back down, finally. "We fund innovation," he continued. "We fund education, but we don't fund protection for the people whose children grow up learning to survive adults." One man scoffed quietly. "You're proposing a social program?" "I'm proposing accountability," Richard said. The room went still. "You want to open us up to scrutiny," someone said. "Childcare policies, labor practices. That's a legal minefield." Richard nodded. "Yes, why would we do that?" the woman asked sharply. Richard met her gaze without hesitation. "Because the alternative is pretending we don't benefit from a system that exhausts people quietly," he said. "And I'm done pretending." His tour. A long silence followed. Finally, the oldest board member spoke. His voice was measured, thoughtful. "What exactly are you proposing?" Richard exhaled slowly. "A pilot program," he said. "Small, controlled, voluntary. On-site childcare partnerships for service staff at properties we influence. Training that includes neurodiversity and de-escalation not as compliance, but as culture." "And the children?" the woman asked. Richard paused. "We listened to them. Workin'." Several board members exchanged looks. "That's not measurable," someone muttered. Richard smiled faintly. Neither was trust. Once, the meeting ended without resolution. No vote, no approval. Just discomfort, lingering in the air like static. That night, Richard sat at Lucas's bedside again. Lucas was building something on the floor blocks arranged in careful, asymmetrical patterns. He hummed quietly as he worked. "What are you making?" Richard asked. "A place where it's okay to be loud sometimes," Lucas said without looking up. Richard swallowed. "That sounds important." Lucas nodded. "Annie would like it." "Would she?" Richard asked. She likes spaces, Lucas said. Not rules. Richard smiled. Later, after Lucas fell asleep, Richard checked his phone. One message stood out. From an unknown number. Maria, thank you for not making promises today. Annie slept holding the blue car. She said it's her quiet thing now. Richard closed his eyes. He typed back slowly. Thank you for trusting me enough to speak. I won't rush. I won't forget. He set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, he understood that change wasn't about speed. It was about endurance. The first crack appeared where Richard hadn't expected it. It wasn't from the board. It wasn't from legal. It wasn't even from investors. It came from within his own company. 3 days after the meeting, his assistant knocked on his office door. Her expression carefully neutral in the way people used when they were about to deliver bad news wrapped in professionalism. Richard, she said, closing the door behind her. HR has some concerns. Of course they do. Richard replied without looking up. About what? She hesitated. About your recent inquiries. Richard set his pen down slowly. Be specific. You asked for internal reviews tied to labor partners, she said. Child care access, neurodiversity training, liability exposure if incidents aren't handled by protocol. And, Richard asked, they're worried you're creating expectations, she said. That staff may assume changes are coming that we can't legally or financially guarantee. Richard leaned back in his chair. What they mean, he said calmly, is that they're worried people might hope. She didn't respond. Set up a meeting, Richard continued. With HR. Legal. Anyone who thinks this is inconvenient. His assistant nodded, then added, more quietly. Some people think this is personal. Richard finally looked at her. It is. Ibs. That evening, Lucas had his first therapy session since the hotel incident. Richard sat in the corner of the softly lit room while Lucas worked with Dr. Myers, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and decades of experience. She didn't rush Lucas. She didn't correct him every time his focus drifted. She waited. So, she said gently, your dad told me you met a new friend. Lucas perked up immediately. Annie. Richard watched carefully. What do you like about Annie? Doctor, Myers asked. Lucas didn't answer right away. He lined up 3 blocks, then nudged one out of place. She doesn't tell me to stop, he said finally. Dr. Myers nodded. That's important. She tells me what to listen to instead, Lucas added. Not what to ignore. Richard felt that sentence lodge itself somewhere deep and permanent. After the session, Dr. Myers asked to speak with Richard alone. You know, she said thoughtfully, what your son experienced wasn't just regulation, it was recognition. Richard frowned slightly. Explain that. Most interventions focus on behavior, she said. Annie focused on being with him. That changes the nervous system faster than instructions. Richard exhaled slowly. She's 6. Dr. Myers smiled. Yes, and she's learned something most adults never do. On the drive home, Lucas was unusually quiet. Did I do okay? He asked suddenly. You did more than okay, Richard said. You were brave. Lucas considered that. Annie is brave too. Yes, Richard agreed. She is. That night, Richard received another message from Maria. Annie asked why some kids get helpers and some don't. I didn't know how to answer. Richard stared at the message for a long time. Finally, he typed back, tell her some helpers are invisible, but that doesn't mean they don't matter. We're trying to change that. The reply came several minutes later. She said, then make them visible. Richard closed his eyes. The HR meeting was worse than he expected. The room was smaller than the boardroom but no less tense. Legal counsel sat with files open. HR executives spoke in careful language. Every sentence framed as concern. You're opening us to precedent, one of them said. If we acknowledge gaps, we imply responsibility. We already have responsibility, Richard replied. We've just outsourced the cost. Another voice chimed in. With respect, Richard, this isn't scalable, I'm said. Richard leaned forward. Neither was seatbelt legislation. Silence followed. You're asking us to redesign culture, the HR director said. No, Richard corrected. I'm asking you to stop designing it around denial. By the end of the meeting, nothing had been approved. But something had shifted. People were no longer dismissing him, they were resisting him, and that meant he was close to something real. At home, Lucas was building again. This time, his blocks formed two separate structures connected by a narrow bridge. What's that? Richard asked. This side is loud, Lucas said, pointing. This side is quiet. And the bridge? Lucas looked up. That's Annie. Richard felt his throat tighten. Anyone can cross? He asked. Lucas nodded. But you have to walk slow. That night, after Lucas was asleep, Richard sat alone in the living room. The house unusually still. For years, he had believed that doing good meant funding things at a distance, writing checks, staying abstract, but Annie had made something painfully clear. Distance was the problem. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. This time, the message was short. This is the hotel GM. We need to talk. Some staff are uncomfortable, and so are some guests. Richard typed back without hesitation. Discomfort is a signal. Let's not ignore it. He set the phone down. Outside, the city hummed the way it always did, indifferent, relentless, full of unseen lives intersecting without acknowledgement. Richard stood and walked to the window. He thought of a 6-year-old girl who had learned to calm chaos because chaos had never asked her permission. He thought of his son, learning that being different did not mean being wrong. And for the first time, Richard understood something fundamental. Justice didn't begin when systems changed. It began when someone powerful decided not to look away anymore. The hotel's private conference room smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Richard sat at one end of the long table, jacket off, sleeves rolled up not as a gesture, but because he had stopped caring how it looked. Across from him sat the general manager, the HR liaison, and a legal representative whose pen never stopped moving. This isn't an accusation, the general manager began, hands folded. But we've received feedback. From whom? Richard asked. Guests, the manager replied. Some staff. And? Richard said calmly. And they feel, the legal representative interjected, choosing her words carefully, that recent events have created uncertainty about boundaries, about expectations. Richard nodded slowly. Good. They all blinked. Uncertainty is what happens when old rules stop working, Richard continued. It's uncomfortable. That doesn't make it dangerous. The HR liaison leaned forward. Richard, with respect, your son's situation was exceptional. And XO. That's exactly the problem, Richard replied. It wasn't. Silence settled over the table. A neurodivergent child had a public episode. Richard continued. Staff froze. Guests judged. And the only person who responded effectively was a 6-year-old girl whose mother cleans rooms. The general manager shifted. We can't base policy on anomalies. She wasn't an anomaly, Richard said. She was prepared by necessity. The legal representative cleared her throat. If we formalize anything resembling that interaction, we expose ourselves to responsibility, Richard finished. Yes. The room went quiet again. Richard leaned back slightly. You're all worried about what happens if we acknowledge the problem. I'm worried about what happens if we don't. The general manager glanced at the others. What exactly are you asking for? Richard took a breath. Training, he said. Not a seminar. Not a checkbox. Real training. On de-escalation. On neurodiversity. On how not to treat a child in distress like a liability. And the children of staff? The HR liaison asked. Richard met her gaze. They shouldn't have to disappear to keep adults comfortable. That landed harder than anything else he'd said. We can start small, Richard added. Pilot programs, quiet rooms, clear protocols that prioritize dignity over optics. And if guests complain? The general manager asked. Richard didn't hesitate. Then we explain who we are. It is backed. The meeting ended without a signature, without applause. But when Richard stood to leave, no one stopped him. That mattered. That evening, Lucas sat on the living room rug, sorting his race cars by color. Red, blue, yellow. He moved quickly, but with purpose. Daddy, he said without looking up. Are you in trouble? Richard smiled faintly. Why do you ask? You make that face, Lucas said, pointing. Richard laughed quietly. That's a good observation. Did they not like Annie? Lucas asked. Richard's smile faded. Some people don't like being reminded that they missed something important. Lucas thought about that. Annie doesn't miss things, he said. No, Richard agreed. She doesn't. Later that night, another message came from Maria. The supervisor asked if Annie needs guidance about boundaries. I said no. But they're watching now. Richard's jaw tightened. He typed back, "Thank you for telling me. You did the right thing. Please tell Annie she's not in trouble." "And neither are you." The reply came quickly. She asked if being watched means she did something bad. Richard closed his eyes. "Tell her being watched sometimes means you did something powerful. And power makes people nervous." A pause. Then, she said, "Okay. But I don't want Mama to be scared." Richard felt that sentence like a bruise. Neither do I. The next day, Richard made a decision that would ripple farther than he could fully predict. He called his communications director. "I want a statement drafted," he said. "Not about the hotel. About values." There was a pause. "Values how?" "Inclusion," Richard replied. "Neurodiversity, labor dignity, community responsibility." "That's broad," she said. "Yes," Richard replied. "So is the truth." When the draft arrived, it was polished, careful, bloodless. Richard rewrote it himself. He removed the jargon. He added a line about children being seen, about listening to those without power, about discomfort being a signal, not a threat. When it was published internally, the response was immediate. Some applauded quietly, some complained loudly, some forwarded it with question marks, and some, many more than Richard expected, simply wrote "thank you." That night, Lucas had a hard time sleeping. "The day is too loud," he said, curling into his pillow. Richard sat beside him, rubbing his back in slow, steady circles. "Do you want to try something Annie taught you?" Richard asked. Lucas nodded. They breathed together, slowly, deliberately. After a few minutes, Lucas whispered, "Daddy?" "Yes. Do you think Annie sleeps okay?" Richard swallowed. "I hope so." Lucas nodded, then added, "If she doesn't, she can come here." Richard smiled, eyes burning. "Yes," he said softly. "She can." Wearily, across the city, in a small apartment above a laundromat, Annie lay beside her mother on a worn couch, the blue race car clutched in her hand. "Mama?" she whispered. "Yes, baby." "Did I do the right thing?" Annie asked. Maria kissed her forehead. "You did, even if people don't like it?" "Especially then," Maria said. Annie nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Back in his own home, Richard stared out into the dark, city lights blinking like distant signals. He understood now that this wasn't about fixing one system or protecting one child. It was about choosing which voices mattered when things got loud, and he was no longer choosing silence. The backlash did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, quiet at first, then louder, then personal. Richard noticed it the morning after the internal statement circulated. His inbox filled with messages that all used the same careful tone, the one people adopted when they wanted to sound reasonable while drawing lines. Concern, risk, optics, precedent. One email stood out, forwarded by his assistant without comment, from Investor Relations. Subject, reputation exposure. Several partners have expressed discomfort with recent internal messaging. There is concern that positioning around labor and neurodiversity may be interpreted as political rather than operational. Richard stared at the screen for a long moment. Political, as if children in distress were a matter of ideology, as if dignity were a brand stance. He closed the email without replying. Instead, he picked up his phone and called Lucas's school. "I'd like to come in this afternoon," he said, "just to observe." The pause on the other end of the line was brief but telling. "Of course," the administrator replied. "We don't usually." "I won't interfere," Richard said. "I just want to watch." That afternoon, Richard sat in a small chair at the back of a brightly colored classroom that felt designed to overwhelm adults. Posters crowded the walls. The air buzzed with low-level noise, shuffling feet, whispered conversations, pencils tapping. Lucas sat near the window. Richard watched his son closely. Lucas rocked slightly as the teacher spoke. His fingers moved constantly, touching the edges of his desk, then retreating. When another child dropped a book, Lucas flinched, shoulders rising instinctively. No one noticed, except Annie would have, Richard thought. The teacher continued, her voice calm but fast. Instructions layered on top of each other. Lucas's breathing changed. Richard leaned forward slightly, resisting the urge to stand. Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out the small cleaning cloth. He pressed it between his palms, squeezing gently, eyes fixed on the window. Slowly, his shoulders lowered. Richard felt his chest tighten. This was the invisible work, not the meltdown, not the disruption, but the constant effort to stay regulated in a world that never slowed down. After class, the teacher approached Richard. "He did well today," she said. "He's been improving." Richard nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated. "We've noticed he uses objects for comfort." "Yes," Richard said. "They help him self-regulate." She smiled politely. "We usually discourage distractions." Richard met her gaze. "Then I'd like to discuss what you consider a distraction." That evening, Richard received another message from Maria. Someone asked Annie why she thinks she can handle grown-up problems. "She asked me if helping Lucas was wrong because he's rich." Richard felt a slow, controlled anger rise. He typed carefully, "Please tell her this. Helping someone doesn't belong to money. It belongs to people." A moment later, the reply came. She said, "Then why do people act like it does?" Richard didn't answer right away, because the truth was too big for a text message. The first article appeared 2 days later. It wasn't overtly hostile. It didn't need to be. "Billionaire CEO pushes inclusive agenda after hotel incident." The headline read. The piece framed the story as a reaction, emotional, impulsive. It questioned motives. It suggested distraction from core business priorities. Richard read it once. Then again. Then he sent it to Mark with a single message. "This is exactly why." That night, Lucas had another difficult moment. Not a meltdown, something quieter, heavier. He sat at the kitchen table, pushing peas around his plate, eyes unfocused. "Daddy," he said finally, "do people not like Annie because she helped me?" Richard froze. "Why do you think that?" he asked gently. Lucas shrugged. "People get mad when things change." Richard reached across the table and took his son's hand. "Some people do," he said, "especially when change reminds them they could have done better." Lucas frowned. "Annie did better." "Yes," Richard said. "She did." "Video, is that bad?" "No," Richard said firmly. "It's brave." Lucas nodded slowly, then asked the question Richard had been dreading. "Are you in trouble because of her?" Richard considered lying. He didn't. "I'm uncomfortable," he said instead. "But that's not the same as being in trouble." Lucas squeezed his hand. "I don't like when you're uncomfortable." Richard smiled softly. "I know. I'm zero." Later that night, Richard sat alone in his office at home. The glow of his computer screen, the only light in the room. He opened a new document. Not a proposal, not a statement, a letter. He began to write not to the board, not to investors, but to himself. He wrote about the first time he'd learned to stay quiet in a room full of powerful people. About how success had taught him to confuse control with safety. He wrote about Annie, about the cost of learning calm too early, about the danger of mistaking maturity for readiness. And he wrote one sentence over and over, until it stopped sounding like rhetoric and started sounding like truth. Discomfort is not harm. Silence is. The next morning, Maria called him for the first time. "I don't usually do this," she said, her voice tight. "But Annie came home crying yesterday." Richard closed his eyes. "What happened?" he asked. "She asked if she should stop helping people," Maria said. "She said maybe it's safer to be quiet." Richard felt something crack inside him. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I never wanted." "I know," Maria interrupted. "I'm not blaming you." She paused. "But I need to know something." She continued. "If this gets worse, if people start making things harder for her, will you still be there?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, "even if it costs me." Maria was quiet for a long moment. "All right," she said finally. "Then I'll tell her to keep being who she is." After the call ended, Richard sat motionless for a long time. He understood now what the real risk was. Not headlines, not backlash, not board resistance. The risk was letting a 6-year-old girl learn that the world only rewarded kindness when it was invisible. And that was a cost he refused to pass on. The call from Maria stayed with Richard longer than any headline ever had. He replayed her words while standing at the kitchen sink the next morning, staring at a coffee that had gone cold. Annie came home crying. Should I stop helping people? The question cut deeper than anger or fear. It carried something far worse, self-erasure. Richard knew that moment. It was the moment a child learned that goodness had a price. He drove Lucas to school himself again. Neither of them spoke much. Lucas hummed softly in the passenger seat, a tune without words, the way he did when he was steadying himself. At a red light, Richard glanced over and saw Lucas pressing the cleaning cloth between his palms, slow and rhythmic. Are you okay? Richard asked. Lucas nodded. I'm thinking. About what? About Annie, Lucas said. She helps people, but people get mad. Richard felt his throat tighten. Yes, he said. Sometimes they do. That doesn't make sense, Lucas said quietly. Helping is good. Richard smiled sadly. It is. When he dropped Lucas off, Richard didn't leave right away. He sat in the car, watching children stream through the doors, some laughing, some dragging their feet, some already tired. He wondered how many Annies were out there, learning too early that kindness needed permission. That afternoon, Richard did something he had avoided his entire career. He stopped trying to be careful. He called a press conference, not a media spin, not a crisis response, a conversation. His communications director was alarmed. Richard, we can still manage this quietly, she urged. Once you speak publicly, you lose control of the narrative. Richard met her gaze. I never had control, he said. I just had distance. The room filled quickly. Reporters, cameras, microphones, all waiting for a statement that would fit neatly into a headline. Richard stood at the podium without notes. I'm not here to talk about my company, he began. I'm here to talk about a child. The room stilled. A 6-year-old girl, he continued, who helped my son during a moment of distress. She did so calmly, instinctively, without recognition, and afterward, she learned that helping might cost her safety. Murmurs rippled through the room. That should trouble all of us, Richard said. Because when a child learns that kindness brings consequences, we have failed not as systems, not as corporations, but as adults. A hand shot up. Is this about race? A reporter asked. Richard didn't flinch. Yes, he said. And class. And power. And whose children are allowed to be seen. Another voice followed. Are you accusing the hotel? Your partners? I'm accusing silence, Richard replied. The kind that protects comfort over courage. The questions came faster now. Is this a political statement? Are you launching a foundation? Is this related to recent backlash from investors? Richard listened. Then he answered the only question that mattered. I'm saying this, he said. If our systems only work when children make themselves smaller, then our systems are broken. That clip would run everywhere. Across the city, Maria watched it on her phone during her break, heart pounding. Annie sat beside her, swinging her legs. Mama? Annie asked. Is that Lucas's dad? Yes, Maria said softly. Annie tilted her head. He looks scared. Maria smiled faintly. Sometimes telling the truth is scary. Annie thought about that. Did he tell it anyway? Yes, Maria said. He did. That evening, Maria received messages from coworkers. Some supportive, some cautious. One warned her to be careful. Another simply said, You're brave. Maria showed none of them to Annie. Instead, she cooked dinner and listened as Annie talked about her drawings, about how blue felt quieter than red, about how the race car needed a garage. Mama, Annie said suddenly. Am I in trouble? Maria set the spoon down and knelt in front of her daughter. No, she said firmly. You are not. But people are watching, Annie said. Watching means I did something big. Maria nodded. Yes. Is big bad? Annie asked. Maria held her daughter's face gently between her hands. Big is powerful, she said. And power scares people who don't want things to change. Annie considered this. Lucas isn't scared of me. It did. No, Maria said, smiling. He isn't. Back at home, Richard sat beside Lucas on the couch. The news played silently on the TV, his face frozen mid-sentence, captions scrolling beneath. Lucas watched for a moment, then looked away. You told them, Lucas said. Yes, Richard replied. Are you in trouble now? Lucas asked. Richard took a breath. Maybe, he said honestly. But I can handle it. Lucas nodded, then said, Annie can't. Richard's chest tightened. No, he said. She shouldn't have to. Lucas climbed closer, leaning against his father. Then it's good you told them. Richard wrapped an arm around his son. I think so too. The fallout was immediate. Some investors pulled back. Others doubled down. Social media fractured into praise and outrage. Think pieces bloomed overnight. People argued about intent, about optics, about whether one child's story could justify discomfort. Richard read none of it. He spent the night drafting one email, not to the board, not to the press, to Maria. I spoke today, not to make you or Annie visible without consent, but to make it harder for the world to pretend she doesn't exist. If this creates pressure you don't want, tell me. I will slow down. I will follow your lead. The reply came an hour later. Annie watched. She said, he didn't look away. That matters. Richard closed his eyes. For the first time since this began, he felt something like peace, not because the path was clear, but because he had chosen it openly. Somewhere in the city, Annie fell asleep with the blue race car tucked under her pillow. Somewhere else, Lucas slept with the light on, breathing steady, and between them, an adult world shifted resistant, uncomfortable, but no longer untouched. The morning after the press conference, the city felt sharper, not louder, just more exposed. Richard noticed it as he walked Lucas to school. The way conversations stopped a half-second too late when people recognized him. The way eyes lingered with curiosity that hadn't been there before. Fame had never bothered him. Scrutiny had always been part of the price of success. This felt different. This felt personal. Lucas sensed it too. They're looking again, he murmured, tightening his grip on Richard's hand. Yes, Richard said. But remember what Annie said. Lucas thought for a moment. I don't have to look back. That's right. At school, the principal asked Richard to step into the office. It's nothing serious, she said quickly, smiling in that careful way administrators did when they wanted cooperation without confrontation. We've just had a few parents call. About what? Richard asked. About attention, she replied. They're concerned Lucas might be getting special treatment. Richard nodded slowly. Lucas needs accommodations, he said. Not attention. The principal cleared her throat. Of course. We just want to be sure everything feels balanced. Balanced, Richard thought, was another word people used when they meant comfortable. After he left the school, Richard drove without a destination for several minutes, letting the city pass him by. He thought of Annie's question, is big bad? And felt the weight of it settle again. Being big, he realized, was only dangerous when it protected itself. At the hotel, things had changed. Not officially, not on paper. But when Maria arrived for her shift that afternoon, two co-workers nodded at her instead of looking away. One whispered, I saw the video. Maria accepted neither praise nor pity. She simply went to work. Annie waited in the staff lounge, drawing again. This time, the picture was different. Two children stood on opposite sides of a wide space. Between them was a line of small shapes, hands, maybe, or stepping stones, or bridges. When her mother came to get her, Annie looked up. Mama, she said, are we loud now? Maria knelt. What do you mean? People talk about us, Annie said. That's loud. Maria thought carefully before answering. Yes, she said, but sometimes loud means people are listening. Annie nodded. Okay. That evening, Richard received a call he had been expecting. It was from the board chair. You've put us in a difficult position, the man said without preamble. I know, Richard replied. You've tied the company to a moral stance, the chair continued. That's risky. Richard was quiet for a moment. So is pretending neutrality when harm is uneven, he said. A pause. We need assurances, the chair said, that this doesn't escalate. Richard leaned back in his chair. Escalate how? Into activism, the man replied. Into expectation. Richard smiled faintly. Expectation is what progress looks like from the wrong angle. The line went quiet. You're prepared to lose support over this? The chair asked. Richard didn't hesitate. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. We'll reconvene, the chair said finally. After the call ended, Richard sat very still. For the first time, he acknowledged the truth fully. He might lose this fight. He might lose influence, capital, position. But if he won, if even one child like Annie learned that the world would not punish her for compassion, then the loss would be worth it. That night, Lucas struggled, not with noise or movement, but with something heavier. I don't want Annie to get hurt, he said suddenly, lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Richard sat beside him. I don't either. What if people stop liking her? Lucas asked. Richard swallowed. Some people might. Lucas turned his head. That's not fair. No, Richard said. It isn't. Lucas was quiet for a moment, then said, if they don't like her, I still do. Richard smiled, eyes burning. That matters more than you know. Across town, Maria tucked Annie into bed. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. Annie held the blue race car loosely now, no longer gripping it like a lifeline. Mama, she whispered. Yes, baby. Am I allowed to help people? Annie asked. Maria lay down beside her daughter and pulled her close. Yes, she said firmly. You are allowed to help. Annie considered this. Even grown-ups? Yes, Maria said. Especially grown-ups. Annie smiled faintly and closed her eyes. The next morning, an envelope appeared on Richard's desk. No return address, just his name, written carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a drawing, 2 children, one smaller, one taller. Between them, a bridge made of uneven blocks. Above them, written in careful, uneven letters, you can walk slow. Richard sat down heavily, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. He understood now. This wasn't about fixing everything. It was about refusing to rush past what mattered. And that choice, slow, deliberate, uncomfortable, was already changing the shape of things. The envelope stayed on Richard's desk longer than any contract ever had. He didn't frame the drawing. He didn't show it to anyone. He slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, where it bent slightly with his movements, and reminded him every time he reached for a pen or shook a hand that this was no longer theoretical. You can walk slow. The words followed him into the next board meeting. This time, the room was fuller. Legal counsel, communications, 2 outside advisors flown in overnight. The air felt thicker, like everyone had already decided something important would break before anyone admitted it. The board chair opened without pleasantries. We've reviewed the situation, Richard nodded. And you've created exposure, the chair said. Not just reputational, structural. Richard folded his hands calmly. Yes. A woman to the chair's right leaned forward. Our partners are uneasy. They're asking whether this is the beginning of a larger shift. Richard met her gaze. It already is. A murmur rippled around the table. You're forcing a conversation the market isn't ready for, another member said. Richard allowed himself a small, humorless smile. The market is never ready for children to be seen. Silence fell. The chair sighed. Richard, we need to know how far you intend to take this. Richard thought of Annie's careful letters, of Lucas's bridge of blocks, of Maria's question. Will you still be there? As far as necessary, he said, and no farther than consent allows. Consent from whom? The woman asked. From the people most affected, Richard replied. Not from the people most comfortable. That answer ended the debate without resolving it. When the meeting adjourned, no one followed Richard out. No one tried to stop him. That silence told him everything. He was on borrowed time. That afternoon, Richard left the office early and drove to Lucas's school. He sat in the parking lot longer than usual, watching children spill out in bursts of noise and color. When Lucas finally emerged, his backpack half-zipped and his hair sticking up at the crown, he looked tired but steady. How was today? Richard asked. as Lucas climbed into the car. Lucas shrugged. Okay. Loud in the morning. Better after. What helped? Richard asked. Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out the cleaning cloth. This. And Mrs. Carter let me sit by the window. Richard nodded. That was good of her. Lucas hesitated. Daddy? Yes? Do you think Annie's school lets her sit by the window? The question hit without warning. I don't know, Richard said honestly, but I hope someone notices when she needs it. Lucas looked out the window, quiet. I noticed, he said after a moment. Richard smiled, blinking hard. Across town, Maria was meeting with her supervisor. The office was small, windowless, and smelled faintly of bleach. The supervisor sat behind her desk, hands folded, expression carefully neutral. Maria, she began. You understand why we need to talk? Maria nodded. Yes, there's been a tension. The supervisor continued. Questions. Media. Way. I know, Maria said. The supervisor hesitated. We need to ensure boundaries are clear, that personal interactions don't. My daughter helped a child breathe, Maria said calmly. She didn't cross a boundary. She saved a moment. The supervisor's jaw tightened. That's not the language corporate uses. Maria met her eyes. Then corporate needs better language. A long pause followed. We're not disciplining you, the supervisor said finally. But we are. Watching. Maria nodded. I understand. Okay. When she left the office, her hands were shaking not with fear, but with restraint. That evening, Annie noticed immediately. Mama, she said, looking up from her drawing. Your shoulders are loud. Maria laughed despite herself. What does that mean? They're up here, Annie said, lifting her own shoulders to her ears. That means something's heavy. Maria sat beside her and lowered her shoulders deliberately. You're right, she said. Something is heavy. Is it me? Annie asked quietly. Maria turned to her daughter at once. No, never you. Annie studied her face. Okay. She went back to drawing, adding another line to the bridge, thicker this time. Back at home, Richard made a call he had been avoiding. Mark, he said, when his friend answered. I need you to prepare something. For what? Mark asked. For the possibility that I won't be CEO much longer, Richard replied. A long silence followed. You're serious, Mark said. Yes, Richard replied. And I need a plan that protects what comes next. What comes next? Mark asked. Richard thought of Annie's drawing, of Maria's shaking hands, of Lucas's quiet bravery. People, he said, not positions. That night, Lucas had trouble settling. The world feels tight, he said, curling under his blanket. Richard lay beside him, keeping his voice low. Do you want to try walking slow? Lucas nodded. They breathed together, counted quietly, let the moment stretch instead of pushing through it. After a while, Lucas whispered, Daddy? Yes? If you lose your job, will you still be my dad? The question broke something open in Richard. Yes, he said immediately. Always. Lucas relaxed, satisfied. Okay. Then, it's fine. Richard stayed awake long after Lucas slept, staring into the dark. He knew the next chapter would be harder. He knew people would test him, pressure him, wait for him to blink. But somewhere in the city, a 6-year-old girl was learning that her kindness mattered, and that was worth more than any title he had ever held. The decision came quietly. No announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just an email sent at 6:12 a.m. Richard read it alone in the kitchen. The house still dark, the coffee maker humming softly behind him. The subject line was neutral, almost polite. Leadership transition discussion. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out at the early morning sky, that brief gray-blue moment before the city fully woke up. For years, this hour had belonged to him alone. Time to prepare, to plan, to stay ahead. Today, he let it linger. When he finally opened the email, the language was exactly what he expected. Appreciation for service, acknowledgement of vision, concern about alignment, a request to step aside temporarily for the stability of the organization. Richard read it once, then he closed his laptop. Lucas padded into the kitchen in his socks a few minutes later, hair messy, eyes half open. Why are you awake so early? he asked. Richard smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. Lucas climbed onto a chair. Is it a loud thought day? Richard considered that. Yes, he said. Lucas nodded as if that explained everything. Do we still have breakfast? Lucas asked. Always, Richard replied. They ate quietly toast, fruit, the comfort of routine. Lucas lined up his blueberries by size before eating them, something Richard no longer tried to correct. After a few minutes, Lucas looked up. Did they ask you to stop? He asked. Richard froze for a fraction of a second. What makes you think that? You get still, Lucas said. Like when you decide something big. Richard exhaled slowly. They asked me to change direction. Lucas frowned. Are you going to? Richard shook his head. No. Lucas relaxed, visibly. Okay, that was it. No follow-up, no fear, just trust. Later that morning, Richard drove Lucas to school and then went somewhere he hadn't planned to go. He drove to the hotel, not to the lobby, not to management, to the side entrance, the one staff used. Maria was finishing her shift when she saw him standing there, hands in his coat pockets, expression serious but gentle. She stopped short. Is something wrong? No, Richard said. Something important. They sat on a low concrete wall outside, the city moving around them. Maria listened as Richard explained carefully, without dramatics. They want me to step back, he said. From the company. Maria absorbed that in silence. And? She asked. And I'm going to, Richard said. On my terms. She studied him. Are you sure? Yes, he said. Because this was never about my position. And if staying means teaching Annie that truth only matters when it's convenient, then I'm done staying. Maria nodded slowly. She asked me last night, Maria said quietly, if grown-ups ever choose kids over rules. Richard felt his chest tighten. What did you tell her? I told her sometimes they do, Maria said. And when they do, it costs them something. Richard smiled sadly. That's honest. Maria looked at him directly. Will you disappear now? No, Richard said immediately. I promise you, I'm not going anywhere. A small pause. Can Annie see Lucas? Maria asked. Just once. So she knows this wasn't a story adults told and forgot. Is no gone. Richard didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. Whenever you're ready. That evening, Richard told Lucas, I won't be going to the big office anymore. He said gently. Lucas looked up from his blocks. Why? Because I chose something else, Richard said. Lucas considered this. Did you choose Annie? Yes, Richard said. And you? And a lot of people who don't get chosen very often. Lucas nodded, then returned to his blocks. I think that's good, he said. The meeting with the board happened 2 days later. It was brief. Richard didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't bargain. He spoke clearly. I'm stepping down, he said. Effective immediately. The chair tried to soften it. This doesn't have to be permanent. Richard met his gaze. No, he said. It doesn't. But they both understood. That chapter was closed. The news broke quietly, then loudly. Speculation followed. Commentary. Analysis. Some praised his integrity. Others called it reckless. Most reduced it to a headline. Richard ignored all of it, because that afternoon, something far more important happened. Annie and Lucas met again. This time, not in chaos. In a small park halfway between their neighborhoods, Maria sat on one bench, Richard on another. The children stood awkwardly at first, unsure. Then Lucas held up the blue race car. I kept it safe, he said. Annie smiled. I knew you would. There was now the Der Greystons' laugh. They sat on the grass, close but not touching. It's quieter here, Annie observed. Lucas nodded. I like quiet. So do I, Annie said. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. They rolled the car back and forth, watched clouds, existed side by side. Maria watched with tears in her eyes. Richard felt something settle inside him that had been restless for years. That night, after everyone went home, Richard sat alone again, but this time, the silence felt earned. He opened his laptop and drafted a single document. Not a resignation letter, not a manifesto. A plan. Small, grounded, community-based. support for families with neurodivergent children, safe spaces, training led by lived experience, not credentials, consent at the center. At the top of the page, he typed a name, not his. Annie. He saved the file. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that a different kind of foundation was being laid not with capital, but with choice. The foundation did not begin with a ceremony. There were no cameras, no ribbon, no carefully worded speeches. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a borrowed community center that smelled faintly of old books and lemon cleaner, with folding chairs arranged in a crooked circle. Richard arrived early, carrying a box of donated sensory toys, soft fabrics, weighted objects, simple tools that invited touch without demand. He set them down quietly, then stepped back, uncertain in a way that felt unfamiliar and necessary. Maria arrived next, Annie's hand tucked into hers. Annie paused at the doorway, scanning the room carefully. Her eyes moved from the windows to the exits, from the chairs to the box on the floor. "It's not too loud," she said finally. "No," Maria replied. "It's not." Lucas came in with Richard a few minutes later, his steps hesitant at first, then lighter when he saw Annie. He didn't run to her. He didn't wave. He simply stood beside her, close enough to feel steady. "Hi," he said. "Hi," Annie answered. That was enough. The group that gathered that morning was small. 3 parents, 2 children, 1 retired teacher, a social worker who had left her agency after burning out. No one introduced themselves with titles. They spoke slowly, carefully, honestly. They talked about exhaustion, about fear, about how often children were expected to carry the weight of adult discomfort. They talked about systems that reacted instead of listening, about rules that punish difference instead of protecting it. Richard did not lead. He listened. When someone asked why the foundation existed, Maria answered before he could. "Because our children already know how to survive," she said. "They shouldn't have to learn it alone." Annie sat on the floor, rolling the blue race car between her palms. Lucas watched her, breathing steady. At one point, another child began to cry, sharp, overwhelmed, collapsing inward. An adult moved instinctively to intervene. Annie stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't touch. She knelt at a careful distance and spoke softly. "You don't have to stop crying," she said. "You just have to know you're not by yourself." The crying slowed, not immediately, but enough. Richard felt something in his chest loosen. This was it. Not a program, not a model, a way of being with one another. Weeks passed, then months. The foundation grew not quickly, but truthfully. There were setbacks, arguments, missteps. Days when Richard wondered if he had been arrogant to think this could work without structure, without hierarchy. And then there were days like the one when Lucas stood in front of a small group and explained, in his own careful way, how noise felt inside his head. Or when Annie corrected an adult gently. "You're talking too fast," she said. "It's okay. Just slower." People listened. Richard no longer wore suits. He wore jeans that smelled faintly of coffee and community center floors. He picked up chairs. He stayed late. He learned when to speak and when to step back. He learned that leadership was not about vision. It was about restraint. One evening, long after most people had gone home, Richard sat on the floor with Maria, sorting donated supplies. "You don't miss it?" she asked suddenly. "The old life?" Richard thought about glass boardrooms and controlled language, about power that never quite touched the ground. "No," he said. "I miss who I thought I had to be to survive it." Maria nodded. "Me too." Across the room, Annie and Lucas sat side by side, drawing. This time, Annie's picture was different again. The bridge was wider now. It had railings. People stood on both sides, not just children. "What's that?" Richard asked gently. "It's not a bridge," Annie said without looking up. "What is it?" "A place where people wait for each other," she replied. Richard swallowed. The world outside did not suddenly become kinder. There were still articles, still critics, still systems slow to change. But something fundamental had shifted. Children were no longer only being taught how to cope. Adults were being taught how to pause. 1 year after the hotel incident, the foundation held its first open gathering. Not an anniversary, a thank you. People came from different neighborhoods, different incomes, different stories. They sat together, ate together, listened. No one asked who funded it. They asked who it was for. At the end of the day, as the sun dipped low and people began to leave, Richard found himself standing again with Maria, watching the children play. "Do you think it was worth it?" Maria asked. Richard looked at Lucas, laughing freely, not guarded. He looked at Annie, calm but unburdened, no longer carrying more than her share. "Yes," he said quietly. "Even if nothing else ever changed." Maria smiled. "Things have changed." That night, Richard tucked Lucas into bed. "Daddy," Lucas said sleepily, "are we still walking slow?" Richard smiled. "Yes, always." Lucas nodded, satisfied, and drifted off. Across the city, Maria tucked Annie in. "Mama," Annie whispered. "Do I still have to help everyone?" Maria kissed her forehead. "No," she said. "You get to choose now." Annie smiled softly. "Okay. Then I'll help when I want to." She closed her eyes. The city hummed on, busy, imperfect, unresolved. But somewhere between a hotel lobby and a community center, between a child who screamed and a child who listened, a different rule had taken root, that no one was too small to matter, that kindness did not need permission, and that sometimes the bravest thing an adult could do was step aside, slow down, and let a child show them how to be human again. The story reminds us that true justice and compassion often come from the quietest places, not the most powerful ones. It shows that children, the poor, and the unseen are often forced to grow wise too early because the world fails to protect them. The lesson is clear. Strength is not found in control, wealth, or status, but in the courage to slow down, to truly see others, and to choose humanity over comfort. When adults listen instead of dismiss, and when power steps aside to make room for empathy, real change begins not loudly, but deeply and lastingly. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.